This next story comes from Gallup, New Mexico. A Navajo woman, now in her late 60s, recalls a time when she is yet a little girl. She has this feeling there is someone outside their house. She runs to her father, who is still in bed, the sun just starting to come up. After finally begging her father to get up, he gets out of bed, puts on some shoes, and goes out to the yard to check. Walking around towards the side of the house to which her bedroom is situated, he notices what appears to be a coyote or dog prints there in the soil directly below her window. The strangest thing out of all this is that there is a trail consisting of only one clear print, and beside it, a round impression, which seems to sit a bit deeper. If there was a coyote outside her window, it was standing upright and on one canine-like foot, and something that's not canine-like. While he is making his way back into the house, something across the way catches his eye. There, upon a small hill to the other side of the dirt road, is a strange-looking old man. His eyes refracting the early sunlight, his hair long and yellowing, and his clothes worn and dirty, ripped apart. But what's more strange out of all this is that he is standing there, barefoot, missing the lower part of his other leg, and supporting himself with the aid of a simple cane of wood. This story is from Fort Belknap. Two of my friends and I are by the street in front of my house, hanging out and talking. I noticed down the block, a ways underneath the halo of the street light, there's this dog. It's just sitting there, but it definitely is not one of the dogs from around the neighborhood, and there's something about it that just doesn't look right to me. I turn to my friends to see what they think, and when they look to where I'm pointing, the dog is gone. And out of nowhere, there's this guy dressed in some grubby clothes, long dirty hair, maybe in his late 20s or early 30s, and definitely in need of a shave. The funny thing though is that he's walking straight towards us and getting closer, but we still can't make out his eyes, almost as if he doesn't have any. Even though we were 3 against 1, without saying a word, we all just started running towards my house. Right up the porch we go, slamming the door behind us. No sooner are we inside, it's like every dog in the neighborhood is barking and whining as if they are scared. Then, just like that, everything gets real quiet, as if somebody hit the mute button. I'm not sure how long we stayed there crouched down low and against the wall beneath the windows. But finally, one of my friends elbows me in the shoulder and tells me with his head that I should take a look outside. Not wanting to look like a complete pussy, I move the curtain aside and peek out. I don't see anything, so I go and open the door. Whoever that guy was, he's gone, and everything seems as it always is. Needless to say, we hung out on the porch for the rest of the night. This story comes out of Arizona. 3 siblings are returning home to the reservation for a weekend visit with their parents. Their trip is taking them from Phoenix to the family home in Low Mountain in Pinyon. It's a trip of about 5 hours. They leave fairly late in the evening. As they approach Keams Canyon Highway, they turn onto a dirt road leading straight into Low Mountain. Just before they reach the dirt road, they notice an old lady bent from age and walking with a cane on the side of the highway. It is about 2 o'clock in the morning. She has a scarf over her head and a long black jacket beneath, and she is also wearing a green dress. Their only thought is that it's a late hour for walking along an isolated highway pretty much in the middle of nowhere. The reservation is really dark at night, and there is barely anyone driving on the roads. After they pass the old woman, they make the turn onto the dirt road. A mile later, they notice the same old lady, bent and walking with her cane there on the side of the dirt road. Spooked by the incident and finding no explanation that would provide for the woman's presence, they had been passed by no other vehicle since turning onto the back road. The older brother, who is driving, steps on the gas and puts distance between them and the roadside specter. Together, the three of them recite some words in Navajo to protect them from any dark medicine. Eventually, they reach the highway that leads to Chinle. As they come to the first overpass, they see that same old lady sitting on the shoulder pavement with her head down and waving the cane in the air. Before they can pass her by, the car stalls out and they are required to roll to a stop a short distance past the woman. Desperately, the older brother attempts to get the car started, but there's no response. At this point, with all three of them panicking, the old lady stands up, facing the opposite way, so they can't see her face, and she walks to the other side of the road. Once there, she turns her head for but a moment, and they see that her face is painted black. She keeps walking and eventually disappears in the distance. Now, out of sight, the brother again turns the key in the ignition and the car starts. They make it to their parents' home with no further encounters. When they tell their parents about the experience, their fathers tells them of an old Navajo couple with a house back in the trees somewhere between the two highways. They are rumored to practice bad medicine and bewitch people. From what he knows, the old man passed away recently, and ever since then, the old woman has been frequently seen at night, walking the highways and the back roads. I heard this account from a guy that I knew. He was my friend when we were in a small town in Oklahoma with a decent size native population. Anyways, this guy, he's not actually Navajo, but he's Mexican. He's the nicest dude you would ever want to meet. He was about 35 at the time. He had a family. He was honest, a good-natured guy that I could never see making something up for no reason. But we were hanging out one night and we were telling scary stories, and he was telling me about the most scariest situation that he's ever been in. He said he was driving back to the US after visiting family in Mexico. His wife was in the passenger seat, asleep. He wasn't too far from the border, so he decided to keep driving a little after midnight instead of stopping somewhere for the night. It was sort of a desert type road. He says he was going about 65 miles per hour when he noticed something in his peripheral vision out in the darkness out the passenger window, and it was keeping up with him. Obviously, this got him shook. He hit the gas, 70, 75, 80, 85, and it was still keeping up with him. At this point, he thought he was going crazy. He thought it was just his tiredness playing tricks on his eyes, until it changed directions. Instead of moving parallel with his car, it began to angle back towards the road, in a manner almost to intercept the vehicle. As it got closer, more light hit it, and he said it looked like a human. He told me it was slightly shadowed from the darkness, but he was for sure it was a humanoid form. He then accelerated to 90, and a few seconds later, it angled back into the darkness and was gone. As he finished telling me the story, I could tell his eyes were welled up and his hands were trembling. And this was a tough, no BS dude. It physically struck him to the core just to recall it. Not surprising, he said he has never gone back to Mexico in a vehicle. Now, he said that whenever he does go visit, he only goes on flights. Yenaglooshi is a forest in far north Norway. I recently moved to Laxalev for work. Even though it was January, I figured that since I was out in the wilderness, that I might as well go out into the woods to explore a bit. There wasn't a whole lot to do in town. Besides, I heard the trails in this part of the country were pretty nice. There was only a few blocks between my house and the edge of the woods. Anyways, I grabbed a bottle of water and a little bag with trail mix. I was going on a trail after all, and off I went. It had snowed the day before. I guess snow is pretty common up here. It was a pretty soft snow, the kind that ski resorts prefer. It would crunch loud as I stepped on it. Despite the trail being covered up by the snow, I was pretty confident in my ability to keep track of the trail, since the forest was somewhat dense, and the opening where the trees were removed was distinguishable, and so I wasn't worried about getting lost. It was still pretty early in the afternoon, only about 1 p.m. I wasn't worried about the sun going down. Then again, I had only moved from Virginia fairly recently, so Norway might as well have been a different planet in terms of climate and daylight. At least, that's what I thought. It might have just been a big change that I was seeing as being bigger than it was. After about half an hour, I wasn't terribly deep in the woods. I was moving at a pretty slow pace after all. I had passed a lot of scenery, but nothing that really stood out, just a lot of trees, a few which had fallen. It was at this point that I realized something that surprised me just a little bit. I wasn't alone in the woods. I stopped briefly when I noticed that a few flakes were weakly drifting to the ground, and noticed that I could hear something else. I could hear the sound of snow crunching under a human's foot. They didn't sound like they were wearing heavy boots or anything. It was much more quiet. I could only really tell it was a person because it was clearly 2 feet. They sounded distant, just barely close enough for me to actually hear it. The woods were pretty quiet. It wasn't windy or anything like that. That's when I saw her in the distance, a woman. Even though my memory is shaky, I say that she was about the ballpark of about 50 yards away. I could just barely see her moving between the trees, drifting almost casually through the snow. But something struck me about her appearance though, so I knew I had to get closer to her to know if I was right or not. So I pursued her. I didn't want to call out to her yet, but I did begin trying to hurry up. She didn't seem like she was moving very fast, but I was struggling to keep sight of her in the forest. Finally, I was about 10 yards away from her, and now I was close enough to confirm what I thought I had seen before. The woman was completely naked. I figured this woman must need help, that she must have been on something, or she was mentally ill. Nobody walks around in the snowy woods with no clothes on, with nothing on. "Excuse me," I piped up, but she didn't acknowledge me. She must have been on some serious drugs. "Excuse me," I repeated, a bit more loud this time. She kept walking, even though when I said that, her pace had slowed just a little bit. I didn't mean to stare, considering the situation, but she really was gorgeous from what I saw of her. Without going into any details, I'll just say her body and what little of her face I managed to see was damn near perfect. I shook off the distraction and began trying to approach her. I got to about 5 yards from her when she suddenly stopped. It was such a sudden thing that I stopped too. "Excuse me, ma'am. Are you okay?" I asked in the best Norwegian I could, even though I knew it wasn't very good. She stood motionless in the forest for a few seconds before quickly turning to me. I then got a good look at her face. She didn't seem bothered by the cold. Her flowing blonde hair looked to have just come from a salon. Her body didn't seem to be reacting to the cold at all. No frostbite, no bluish tint, no shivering, not even one single goosebump. What really struck me about her was her eyes. Her eyes were an icy, cold-looking blue, almost gray. She had no expression, and despite having turned to me, she didn't seem to really notice that I was there. Her face and body language didn't indicate that she was actually acknowledging me. She never looked directly at me. I figured that she must really be on some serious drugs. I stopped for a second or two to think of what she might be on, before remembering her current situation. Ma'am, are you alright?" I repeated. No response. "I can call a hospital for you if you need me to," I offered. At that point, I realized that I didn't bring my cell phone with me. Shit, what would I do now? I had no way of contacting authorities with this drugged up naked lady in the middle of the frozen woods, but I didn't feel comfortable just leaving her out here to go and get help. What if a search team wouldn't be able to find her in time? How long has she been out here anyways? I figured that my best option would be trying to get her to follow me back to town. "Ma'am, would you like my coat?" I offered. It was better than just letting her freeze, after all. She didn't react to my question at all, despite the cold. I took my coat off and began to approach her. That's when I noticed something I didn't notice before. Her fingers and toes now seemed to be a blue color. She didn't seem at all frostbitten not a moment ago. Where did that come from so fast? I knew I had to get her out of here, and fast. As I got closer, there was more frostbite I hadn't noticed before on her nose and ears. Suddenly, she turned away from me and began walking away. "Hey, wait!" I called out to her. No response. Suddenly, her pace quickened. A few seconds later, she was running. And a few seconds after that, she was out of sight. "Damn it," I shouted. I would have to try to follow her footprints in the snow now. But that's when I noticed that she wasn't leaving any footprints. What the hell was going on here? A naked lady walking aimlessly in the middle of a Norwegian winter with randomly appearing frostbite, and she wasn't leaving any footprints? Was she on drugs? Or was I? I thought about just turning back and trying to go back to town, but I still thought it would be better to find her and lead her back. I would just grab her and carry or drag her if necessary. I wasn't gonna let this lady freeze to death while I could do something about it, even if she was apparently levitating. It was then at that point that I realized that I didn't know where I was. In my attempts to get to her, I had lost track of the trail. Well, now I felt stupid. My own footprints, I thought. I turned around and found that my footprints were also gone. My trail now just started where I was standing at the moment. Had the snow filled them in, or was I going crazy? I know for a fact though that I wasn't levitating. It was at this revelation that I was becoming afraid. Something was seriously wrong here. What could I do now? I didn't know where the lady was anymore, and I didn't know how to get back to town, even if I did find her. This place is a big expanse of forest. It eventually extends back to a mountain range. Unfortunately, The trees were too thick to see the mountains for reference. Where the fuck was I? I could see one thing, however. The sun was starting to go down. The sun goes down pretty early around here. I guess it was a mistake to go out this late, since I figured I would have been home by now. I decided that all I could really do was just start walking the same direction I thought I had come from. I picked the direction that had been directly behind me when I lost sight of the woman. I figured that if I could find the trail, it would be easy. But I felt terrible leaving her that way. But I needed to know where the hell I was before I could effectively help her. I was now considering just rushing home and calling the authorities to be the best available option. But first, I needed to find home. I walked for what felt like hours, through snow and trees, without ever finding a trail. I didn't know if my mind was playing tricks on me, similar to my footprints disappearing, or if I had actually gone in the wrong direction. I paused to look around when I noticed a woman walking off in the distance. Relative to where I was, she was at 3:30, about 20 yards away. I stared at her for a few seconds, realizing that she was actually looking at me. The fact that she was looking at me was creepier than when she wasn't. I was frozen in place, too confused to approach her. I knew I needed to help her, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to anymore. All of this seemed so off. She then began taking a few slow steps towards me, to where I was. I don't know why, but I was getting scared now. I took a few steps back to attempt to match the ground she was gaining on me. She didn't seem determined to get to me. In fact, despite looking at me, she didn't seem like she actually noticed me. I was, for some reason, apprehensive to turn away from her and just run. I was still clinging to the idea that this was just some normal woman out of her mind on drugs who also needed my help. My own pace was beginning to slow down. I don't know why, but I wanted to get away from her for some reason. But my body just wasn't moving the way it should have been. On top of that, I was so cold. It was like ice was forming in my blood, and she was catching up to me pretty quickly. "Ma'am, if you need help, I can help you," I said. "We can get back to town. Lakasalev, you know where that is, right? It's just on the outside of the woods here. Do you want me to help you?" No response. I looked down and noticed that her hands and feet were frostbitten. There was also patches of frostbite all over her body now. Had her condition become more severe? When she got closer, the frostbite was also on her lips, turning them a blue color. Her chest and face were slowly becoming flushed in a frosty blue. "Ma'am, your frostbite is getting worse. We need to get you to town. Here, take my coat," I said. I was actually becoming panicked at her bizarre behavior and this entire situation. There really was something severely wrong here. A large clump of snow fell from a branch above my head and crashed on my head. It didn't hurt, but I had to wipe the snow from my eyes. It took little effort getting it out. I looked up from my struggle to notice her now standing very close to me, nearly 3 feet away. That's when I lost it. I began to will myself away from her. I took off running, not caring which way I was heading anymore. As long as I could get away from that monster, that thing. She wasn't human, or if she was, she wasn't a normal human. When I looked up at her that time, her body was completely covered in frostbite. Her entire skin was a deep blue color, patches of decay. Her forearms down and her legs on down were skeletal. Her face was mutilated by frostbite. Her ears and nose missing, the rims of her lips missing. Her chest was actually missing entirely, with a large patch of mutilation carved into her chest by frostbite, exposing just a small amount of her rib cage. I was just about out of my mind. I was actually running now. I had no idea where I would end up. I was just hoping to find the edge of the woods before she might have found me. I couldn't tell at all if I was getting closer to safety or further into the woods. Then I kind of wonder if just escaping the woods would be enough. Would she follow me out? I didn't know what to think anymore. That thing, obviously, wasn't human anymore, assuming it ever really was. So I didn't even know if it would conform to human logic. All I could do was cycle through begging not to be found, begging to escape somewhere else, begging to escape somewhere safe, cursing my entire decision to go walking out in the woods, cursing the woods themselves, asking what the hell she was. All of this. It was all I could do while running to avoid going crazy. I don't know what's going on. Maybe it was making the whole thing worse. I ran for what must have been another few hours, and it was dark now. As I was running, I tripped over a root, steered sideways, and slammed my back into a tree. It was now too dark for me to see anything, and I was now too tired to even move. If she were to find me, that's all there was to it. I would have to rest, build up some strength. I backed myself up against the tree I had collided with and stared into the blackness, hoping not to get attacked. I remember the food I brought with me and pulled out my bottle of water. All of the liquid had frozen solid. I found it very strange because I didn't really think it was cold enough for that to happen, especially since it had been in my coat pocket the entire time. Maybe I was going crazy, or maybe I was just losing it. Well, I couldn't drink ice, so I moved on to the trail mix. It was fine and gave me a bit of strength. Stopping to eat actually gave me the chance to try to collect myself. I could really only wonder what the fuck that thing was, why I was seeing so many weird things going on with the snow and ice. There had to be some kind of connection, but I wasn't about to approach any solid ideas as to what it was. As I sat in the dark, I could hear snow crunching somewhere. It was pitch black, but I could tell it was somewhere to my right. I was too exhausted to move now. All I could really do was sit against the tree and hope she didn't find me, or at least hope that whatever she would do to me wouldn't be too bad. But for some reason I doubted that. When I looked at her back then, she was looking at me for just a second. When I could see what she really was, that frostbitten body, her eyes stayed, but they were glazed over, like she was drugged or something. For just a second she looked right at me. I can't even think of what she might have wanted to do to me, but I'm not really liking any of my options right now. As I sat there, listening to the distant crunching, I focused so intently. I could feel every single snowflake that was hitting me. They seemed to be getting colder, somehow. The entire forest seemed to be dropping in temperature. I honestly wasn't sure I would live to see her catch me. I might end up freezing first. I was trying to think that maybe I shouldn't just be sitting here, but I couldn't decide which was more dangerous. Walking around hoping not to be found, or sitting in one spot hoping not to be found. I wasn't sure what to do either way. I looked behind the tree to still see nothing in the dark. I was pretty quickly darting my eyes and head around, desperately trying to get a visual on something, anything. I couldn't even see the tree I was leaning against. It must have been a new moon or something. I was so paranoid. I was pretty quickly losing track of time. I had no idea what time it might be, but things were starting to get blurry. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because out of nowhere, I opened my eyes to see broad daylight. In hindsight, I kind of wish I'd been able to stay awake. Even though nothing happened, something easily could have. In fact, whatever that thing was, seemed to have such a good grasp on the woods. I'm actually surprised she didn't find me. The only thing I can really think of is that she must have found me, but thought it would be too easy if I was sleeping when she did it. I looked to my right and saw footprints in the snow. Not a trail, just 2 footprints, side by side, like somebody was hovering over me, landed right there, and flew away. Was she watching me the entire night? Fuck that. I think that might actually be worse than if she caught me, cause now I know she's toying with me. I'm not sure if she considered me more prey or a toy, but I didn't like either option. Now that it was morning and I had rested, I decided I needed to start running again, trying to find the trail, the edge of the woods, anything. Honestly, I was sore as hell from all that running, but I guess I couldn't avoid more of it. I started off at a slow walk, keeping my eyes out for whatever that thing might be. This was a bit difficult, since I wanted desperately to just take off and run. I had to think about where I was going, instead of just zipping around blindly. I thought of looking for moss on trees, since I knew the woods were to the southeast of town. Conveniently, the trees had no moss at all, nor did the nearby rocks. I tried to think back on where the sun set last night, but I wasn't awake to see it rise, and I was running so blindly I didn't notice where it set. The sun was currently to my left, but I didn't know what time it was or what direction that was, so that was worthless. I wish I was an expert tracker. I'm sure some hunter or navigator would be able to get me out of the woods. So now I just had to walk, hoping I was going in the right direction, hoping I wouldn't run into that thing again. I walked for a while, what had to be about 2 hours or so. I still didn't seem to be anywhere near the edge of the woods. I still couldn't see anything. It was mostly just a flat plain of snow with trees all around it. I kinda wish they had put a sign up at the edge of the woods, warning people not to go into it. Then again, I'm pretty sure a sign that said, "Warning, naked zombie lady," would be dismissed as a joke. At this point, I realized I was stupid and just ate a handful of snow. I completely forgot that snow was just fluffy water, and just went without liquid because my water bottle was frozen. I must have been so confused from where I was exhausted that I didn't even think of it. With that refresher, I began to realize I was being followed again. I could hear the snow crunching from behind me again. I turned to face it, but there was nothing there. I gazed around, but still couldn't see anything. I needed to hurry up before that thing caught up to me, so I got up and kept moving. It was hours later, and I still didn't see any scenery that looked even remotely unique. I had no idea these woods were this big. I realized that nobody really knew me, so nobody would be looking for me either way. I wasn't really counting on that anyways. Honestly, I just needed to find a way out. At this rate, I wasn't sure if I was just walking in circles or not. I could have been for all I knew. At this point, I realized the sun was hanging low. That must have been west. I knew I needed to go northwest, so all I had to do was head in some direction from there. I didn't know where I would come out, but it was worth a shot, so I started walking. I walked for several more hours in what I assumed was a straight line. It didn't seem to be taking me anywhere. I looked up trying to focus on the sun, trying to see which way I was going. Around then, I turned around to see the path where I was coming from. That's when I saw her, the woman, standing directly across from me. She was far enough away that I couldn't see if there was any frostbite on her this time. She didn't look like it, but she was staring directly at me and walking towards me. I was in a better position this time, or at least I thought. I knew where the hell I was going. I turned left and started running towards the sun. I knew that there was a highway that went through a part of the woods. I wasn't so intent on getting to the highway as my definite destination. If she blocks my path directly to town, I can find some semblance of civilization. I ran for a few minutes before realizing that I had lost her, or at least it looked like I did. I wasn't sure anymore. I knew she could be anywhere. I slowed to a stop and surveyed my surroundings. I couldn't see her anywhere, nor any sign of her. A small amount of sunlight was peeking through the trees now, but I could tell it would most likely be setting within the hour. I had to find my way out before that happened, otherwise I would lose my only usable reference point. I took off running again, sprinting through the forest, dodging between trees. I had no idea how long I was running for, maybe 45 minutes, but it was also getting darker. I was losing light and my ability to navigate. I could only try to keep running in a single direction, then just keep going that same way once the sun was down. I felt I had a pretty good system now. Surely, I couldn't get lost if I kept in a straight line. The only thing I really had to worry about was getting interrupted. At that point, I crashed into a tree. I had been running for hours. I must have been tired again. My coat wasn't really protecting me from the environment the way it should have been also. As I slowly rose to my feet, I saw an opening in the trees. It was the trail. I had finally found it again. I climbed back to 2 feet and staggered onto it. I felt a lot better knowing I had found a sign that I was on the right track. I then realized I had something of a conundrum. Should I really follow the trail, or should I keep going in a straight line the way I was? I remember seeing a map of the trail outside, seeing that it wasn't just one trail, but a huge network. I don't remember any specific directions, but I knew that just blindly following the trail might not necessarily be a good idea, especially now that I was already on a good path. I decided the trail could screw itself and kept walking in a straight line. It was also very dark now. I could barely see. I couldn't quite move as quickly as I was before, but I wasn't about to just stop. I didn't trust my safety to that monster. It was now practically pitch black again. I didn't know what time it must have been. I had been switching between walking and running for more than 24 hours now. When the fuck would these woods end? These woods couldn't have been this expansive. They just couldn't have been. I must have been just completely lost at this point. I didn't know what to think at that point, and I still didn't know, to be honest. I was lost in thought, and then I realized the sun went down. The night wasn't quite as dark as the night before, but it was still nearly pitch black. I wouldn't just be running blindly anymore, so I kept walking straight. I felt in front of me for trees, groping blindly like an idiot. I must have looked like one to that sadistic bitch. I went on grabbing at nothing for several hours. It had to be past midnight when I felt something that wasn't natural. I felt a quick brush of a wispy, spiderweb-like form. It was hair. That woman's hair. That thing's hair. I stepped back for a second. Looking around in the darkness, I couldn't see her anywhere. I could just barely make out the trees around me. I stood mostly blind, helpless against this monster in the dark. At this point, not being able to see her was worse than actually seeing her. That paranoia that grips you as a little kid in your bedroom, staring at the closet, waiting for the boogeyman to come out and eat you. I finally took a step, not feeling any sign of her anywhere. I kept taking a few very slow steps, trying to make some kind of headway. At this rate, I wasn't sure I would even notice if I was out of the woods or not. I could be standing in a field and I might not really notice. I debunked all of this when I felt the bark of a tree in front of me. I began maneuvering around it, keeping at its base to avoid losing my direction. As I rounded the trunk, I felt something. I felt 2 icy cold, skeletal hands lightly caressed the sides of my neck. I felt what must have been, whatever the fuck that thing was. Its shredded lips lightly kissed my ear. At that moment, I fucking lost it. I turned around, took a swing, hitting nothing, and turned back, taking off running. Kinda funny how quickly I abandoned my plan of just staying slow. I have no idea what the fuck that thing wanted. but it wouldn't be getting it from me. I sprinted through the woods, occasionally bumping into the edge of a tree, heading where I prayed, which was northwest. I was in a full panic, just barely keeping it together enough to remember where I was supposed to be going. It was a flashback to the night before, where I just ran blindly and got myself lost as I was. At least now, I could hope I had stayed in the right direction this time, but I wasn't banking on it. I had to avoid trees in the dark, hoping that lady wasn't behind me or in front of me. But that might be the thing that made me panic the most. The idea that I would just run right into her in the dark and never see her coming. I couldn't shake that feeling. I never felt like she wasn't right next to me. I knew she was always somewhere close by, watching me, waiting for whatever she wanted from me. At some point in the dark, I suddenly ran right into something. It was low and hard. It seemed to be a big rock. I felt one of my shin bones shatter on contact from how hard I was running, combined with the shape of it. I went flying over it, rode over the top of it, and landed in what seemed to be a collection of smaller rocks. I then started groping my way around before finding my footing. The rocks I was standing on were loose, so I ended up falling again. My hand landed just the right way for me to get an idea of the rock itself. It felt so strange. It actually didn't seem like stone. It was too light for that. I picked it up and felt its shape, discovering it to be a bone. I felt around a bit more and found that all of the small rocks I was laying on were actually bones, some of them clearly human. I began trying to crawl my way out before brushing my head on something metallic. I picked it up, finding it to be an old lighter. I gave it a few clicks to see if it worked. I have no idea if it did, since I was terrible with lighters. I never could get one to light up. As I sat there, I felt something brush against my leg. It was a hand. I jumped back, assuming it was her. As I backed away, I heard what I can only describe as a hoarse, weak, wheezing noise. I grabbed a large rock, crawling over it, attempting to rest for energy. I wasn't sure how well I could do with that busted leg bone. As I sat back, I could hear snow crunching from behind me. I listened carefully, trying to see exactly where it was coming from. How close was it? It was in the bone pile apparently. The footsteps suddenly stopped as I heard total silence for a few seconds. The wheezing kicked back, more panic sounding this time, like a person who had their vocal cords cut desperately, trying to talk. I suddenly began hearing a different crunching noise. It sounded like bone breaking. It sounded like flesh tearing. I didn't know what was worse, what was happening, or what might be happening, and not knowing was killing me. I had to know what it was. Curiosity was driving me crazy, even though I dreaded what the answer to my question might be. Finally, I decided I had to see. I peeked over the rock, seeing nothing but darkness, of course. But then I remembered the lighter. I gave it a few flicks before finally getting the damn thing to light. When I looked down, I saw her. I now saw the full scope of the bone pile. It was huge. It looked almost like one of those mass graves that genocides and massacres have been known to produce. There were some animal bones too, deer, birds, dogs, but it seemed like it was mostly human bones. As I looked closely, I saw tooth marks on the bones. As I looked up, I saw exactly what she was doing, the exact source of that noise. It was a man. It looked to be a middle-aged man, or at least what was left of him. His body was missing from around his stomach down. She was holding his torso up, devouring him. She was biting off organs and flesh, breaking bone with her teeth, where it had once wore its disguise as a normal woman, attempting to maintain a sort of dignity or beauty. All of it had mostly been abandoned. Its mouth opened too wide. mostly due to what seemed to be her cheeks missing as she tore off huge chunks of flesh like an animal. She then looked up at me, giving me a frigid look with those eyes. She glared at me, her female dignity returning. She stood, her mouth covered in frozen blood. The man seemed to be fading quickly. His body was blue from frostbite. I have no idea how he was still alive, but he most likely wouldn't be for much longer. As she approached me, she took further notice of the lighter I carried. She seemed to shy away from me when she saw it, like she was afraid of it, but she still approached me, slowly, inching closer. As she approached, I realized what it was. Everything about her was cold. Her body was cold. Her home was cold. Her victims were cold. Her food was cold. So anything with heat must have been something she can't deal with. As she was within arm's reach, I thrust the lighter at her. She quickly backed away before continuing her approach. I tried this a few more times before realizing that I was right. She couldn't stand heat. At this point, I had a crazy idea that I must have gotten from an action movie. I figured that if she was afraid or weakened by heat, I could set her on fire and possibly be done with her for good. As well as I could, I kept the lighter lit up and gently tossed it at her, reaching right into her hair. Her hair, lightly, catching a slight bit of fire before the lighter faded out onto the ground. I couldn't see what was happening, just embers coming from her, apparently burning her hair. I didn't want to stick around. This thing didn't seem to be very mortal, so I didn't want to risk the idea that I had only pissed it off. As best as I could with my busted up leg, I took off running, which actually wasn't very fast, more like limping away, but it was fast enough. I didn't see any really convincing signs that she was following me, but I'll never be sure. Everything after that is just kind of blurry. I have no clue how long I must have been running. It seemed almost like I must have fallen asleep while running, because suddenly I was reaching the highway, staggering out onto the pavement and collapsing. At this point, I blacked out. What happened between then and when I woke up in the hospital was extremely fuzzy. I must have been picked up by somebody at some point, but I don't remember who they were or when they came along. What I do remember was coming to my senses for a few seconds in somebody's car, or it might have been the cab of a truck. The person asked me who I was, and I answered. They asked me what I was doing out in the woods and what happened to me. For all I know, I blacked out again before I could answer. I woke up in the hospital in the afternoon. The doctors and police were asking me what happened to me. I didn't mention the bones, fearing that by doing so, I would end up sending some police officers to their death. I just told them that I had gone for a walk in the woods and became hopelessly lost. One officer asked me about the marks on my body. Apparently, when the woman touched me, she left marks of frostbite on my neck in the shape of skeletal hands. That's when I told them that I had no idea how that came to be. They didn't really seem to press the issue after that. I got home a few days later. I started my job a few days after that. I wasn't really that great in Norwegian, but had a passing knowledge of it. I asked a few coworkers about the woods, about that forest. An older guy told me about the woods being haunted by something, but he didn't really elaborate, and I don't think I really needed him to, since I knew all that I needed to know about it. On some occasions, I feel like I'm still sometimes back there, when I get a sudden chilly draft in my house, and the feeling that I'm being watched. Even in the summer, even after I have moved out the country, which once again for work, the frostbite she left on my neck left a very visible scar. It still does hurt a little bit, especially on cold, snowy days. I don't recommend ever going there, not even for a second. I don't know what that thing was, where she came from, or if she even survived my attack. I was lucky to have gotten away, because I know that if I hadn't found that lighter, I would most likely have ended up the same as that guy. I do still warn you though, that if you ever do decide to go, I can't promise that you'll do any better than I did. And to all the men out there, if you ever see a naked woman out in the woods, don't ever approach her. As a matter of fact, run. Turn the other way and run opposite of her as fast as you can. This is not a story, but a real life event that actually happened to me. I live in a small town in Kentucky where there is nothing, no hope, no jobs, and nothing but churches all around. I was at church one night, and this preacher put his hand on my head and prayed that God would reveal himself to me. He then went on to the next person to pray. I got up and started walking towards the exit of the church. All the jumping and shouting was scaring me, and honestly, it feels nothing of God. It seems like it's more the perks kicking in than anything else. As I left out the door, I went outside to smoke. I walk around the building, and there's a little creek behind the church, so I ended up walking back behind there. As I was standing out there, smoking a cigarette, the hair stood up on my neck, and I got the feeling that I was being watched. I noticed across the creek, in between a bunch of trees, was a pair of red eyes, but they didn't seem scary nor evil. They just seemed curious, interested. I stared back at it, and it felt like we were staring for hours, but it was just a few minutes. There was nothing, no movement, no blinking, nothing. I then heard somebody walking behind me. I turned back, and I saw it was another person who was also coming outside to smoke a cigarette. As I turned back around, the creature, or this thing, was gone. After talking and smoking, we both went back into the church, and I never saw the eyes again. I still wonder what that thing was, whatever it was. It couldn't have been an angel or God. I'm starting to think it was the devil waiting outside the church. To give you a little more insight about me, this story happened when I was 14 years old. I was at my friend Emily's house, since back then I lived there for personal reasons. Anyways, it was about 1 a.m, and her parents were gone for the night. We were watching scary movies and eating out on snacks like we usually would every weekend night. After our movie, I got up to go to the restroom, and I let my friend know that I would be back. She nodded before opening up her laptop to message her boyfriend at the time. As I walked down the dark hallway and I was coming across the bathroom, I heard my friend's voice call out to me, but it was coming from the back porch that was on the right side of the hallway, which immediately struck me as odd because I never seen her leave the room or even walk past me. And why would she be outside anyways at this time? Her voice called out to me again, so I couldn't help it but walk out to the back porch. It does take a lot to scare me after all, so I wasn't bothered by this. As it turns out, it was the biggest mistake ever. A red flag should have went off right then and there when her voice became silent as I stepped outside. I called her name softly, but she didn't reply. I called her name once more, but this time, louder. And again, nothing but silence. I stepped off the porch into the grass looking into her wooded backyard, a little pissed off now because at that time, I figured she was trying to prank scare me, like she always was. It was a normal thing for her, but when I yelled her name again, a voice spoke. but it wasn't hers. It was another woman's voice. "Help me, please, for the love of God, help me." Okay, now I was officially freaked out because there was no one around for miles besides her one neighbor that lives a little ways into the woods. I found myself not being able to move. Curiosity maybe? But the bushes started rustling and what looked like a dog stepped out. At first I thought it was her neighbor's dog that must have gotten out again because it has happened before. But when this thing stood up on its hind legs, it was about 7 feet tall. That's when I really froze up. What the hell was this thing? I asked myself. I never met any human that's this tall in my entire life. Then it started to move towards me. It was walking kind of like a human, but wobbling like a baby taking its first steps. I found myself not being able to move, to get out of there like I should have. That is, until I heard the slider door being opened, and the real Emily's voice speak. "Lana, what are you doing outside? I looked around my whole house for you." As soon as she finished her sentence, I ran inside as fast as I could and pulled my friend inside before shutting the door and locking it while closing the blinds. I did this to every room, even the basement, locking all the windows included. All the while, Emily yelling at me, asking me what the fuck was going on. I took her arm and raced into her room before slamming her door behind us. When she finally realized how terrified I was and how badly I was shaking, only then did she ask me, "Jesus, Lana, what's the matter? You look like you just seen a ghost." I finally calmed down enough to begin to tell her what I encountered, but before I got the chance to fully explain what happened, I heard extreme banging on my friend's window, which shocked us both and we both shot up at least 10 feet in the air. I whisper, "Fuck." I realized I forgot to shut the blinds. I didn't have the heart to turn around, but when Emily's face went pale, I didn't have a choice but to look behind me. I really wish I hadn't. There, that thing was, looking into our bedroom window. I couldn't even begin to explain what it looked like. All I can come up with is that its body was twisted like someone that had just been in a freakish car accident, and it had fur, lots of it, and the eyes glowed much like a cat. A high-pitched noise escaped that thing's throat, making us not only cover our ears, but we both screamed as hard as our lungs would let us. I threw my friend on the floor before zooming into her parents' room to get her dad's .42 rifle. But when I came back, the noise stopped, and that creature was gone. Emily was rocking back and forth, holding her knees close to her, shaking and crying. She saw its face as clear as I did. The rest of the night, we had all the lights on in the house, and we stayed huddled together in the living room with the rifle right under my legs. Finally, after what seemed like years, the sun rose and her parents walked through the door. Instantly, her dad noticed our fear-stricken expressions and his gun under my legs. They sat down and softly asked both of us what happened. When I explained it, they shared worried glances before announcing that we were moving. We never asked why. We were just happy to get the hell out of there. We moved that exact day to my family's vacation home in a very populated city with little to no trees. When my own parents got home and we told them, they had the same reactions. And they told me I could never go out after dark alone and to stay away from wooded areas. Of course, I never questioned it. And to this day, I don't know if it was a Skinwalker that some people believe in, or if it was an imposter. What I do know, though, that it was not human. My mom recently shared a strange and creepy experience that she and her siblings and parents witnessed when she was younger, at around 6 years of age. My mom is not the type of person to lie about this just to scare someone. And also, my aunts and uncles have verified the story individually. My grandparents, mother, aunts, and uncles lived in a small pueblo, a small town, in Mexico with a population of about 1,000 people. They were all scattered throughout the landscape. They lived at the bottom of one of the larger cerros, or hills, that would take a couple of hours to get to the very top. My abuelitos were very poor. My grandfather was making just enough to provide for their necessities by working at a sugarcane field, but yet they were living in one of the nicer homes because of its proximity to the hill and what everyone would say, a witch's house at the top of that hill. Everybody around there stayed away from that house, and the rent was the cheapest there was out of everything else, out of all the other houses that were available. My abuelitos, grandparents, tias y tíos, aunts and uncles, and my mom had some paranormal experiences in that house. Most of these were attributed to the witch in typical Mexican folklore fashion. This thing that they witnessed, however, was what made them leave. Mi madre, my mom, says that one day she was inside at the entrance of the home with the door wide open, playing with some toys. My tíos and tías, aunts and uncles, were in the same room behind her also, while my abuelito was relaxing on a rocking chair in that room. She said she was playing and the door to the house was open. As she looked up, as a medium-sized black dog was walking along the road in front of the home. What spooked her was that this dog had 2 human breasts hanging from its chest that were connected to its skin as if it was part of its body. She says that the breasts were hairless, which allowed her to see that they were indeed the breast of a human and not some sort of tumor on the dog. My mom says that the dog instantly gave her a very bad feeling and she started to cry. My mom's crying then caused the dog to stop in its tracks and look into the doorway towards my mom. That's when my grandfather got up and headed towards the door, as so did my uncles, to see what was happening. He instantly recognized what the creature was and pulled out a small gun he always carried with him because of the long treks he made on foot to his job. He aimed the gun and tried pulling the trigger, but the gun kept jamming and would not fire. He tried it a few times, each time checking and making sure the gun was in proper working order, but it simply would not fire. All the while, the dog was just standing there, watching. The dog eventually turned and started running down the road and into some overgrowth along the side of the road. After it disappeared from view, my grandfather tried shooting his gun and it fired without a hitch. Even though they were very limited financial-wise, they moved out within a week after this encounter. Unfortunately, both of my grandparents passed when I was very young, so I cannot ask them about this event. I also never heard of skinwalkers partially changing, turning, and I found this story quite interesting. Sometimes, when we gather together as a family, joking and playing and having a good time, I tell my mom to bring up this story just to give everybody a spook. In a quick summary, that she saw a black dog with human breast hanging from its chest. Grandfather's firearm jammed when he was trying to fire at the dog, and then the gun started working perfectly fine once this dog ran away. Most of my family, when they hear this story, believe it was the bruja, the witch, who lived on top of the cerro, the hill, who apparently, they always say, was a nagual. My mom told me about an experience that she had when she encountered a nagual in the place where my mom grew up. She said that a group of town people were saying that they were seeing a large black bird out at night and it was creeping people out. So one day, some guys got in a truck and encountered a large black bird in the middle of the road following them. One guy took a shot at it, and they said that the bullet went through its wing and it flew away. But they recall that when they shot it, they heard the scream, the wail of a woman. Later on, they noticed that an old lady who lived in an isolated home by herself all of a sudden had her arm in a sling, and she had a wound from a gunshot. She had already been suspected of being a bruja or a nagual, and they believed that this incident confirmed it. I'm not Navajo or Native or even Indian, but I have a Skinwalker story. So here it goes. I go along with a friend to check out his grandfather's hogan. For those who don't know, a hogan is basically an old traditional Navajo dwelling place, mostly made out of logs and mud, with a door traditionally facing east. Anyways, his grandfather is in the hospital for a spell. My friend says that his grandfather had an accident there on the property. We get to the place and we're hanging out for a while, drinking some beers and sharing a blunt. When out of nowhere, my friend goes real still and puts his finger up to his lips like he wants me to be quiet. I hear this shuffling noise coming from just outside. And just an FYI, my friend has dark skin. So as I look at him, his face turns several shades more pale. The shuffling noise becomes more loud, as if someone is coming towards the door. My friend grabs a piece of burning firewood out of the stove. He goes over to the door and hurls it out in front of the hogan. We then hear it hit the ground, and immediately there is this high-pitched laughter, something like the Wicked Witch of the West. Every hair on my body stands up. My friend starts yelling out in some native language. All I can do is pull out my pocket knife and hold it up to be ready. The person outside just keeps laughing, and I finally get the cojones to move over towards the door and peek out. My heart nearly jumps out of my chest. Only several feet from me is this Skinwalker. It's leaning up against the wall just to the right, thin and scraggly, covered with these animal skins, and staring back at me with these eyes like black marbles. I'm convinced it's a woman, as I see what looks to be breasts beneath the skins, but thin and sagging, like she's really old. Her face is covered with splotches of hair, and I can't tell if it's real or some kind of get-up. I let out a bit of scream, though I hate to admit it, and it just turns and jogs off towards the hills to the other side of the hogan. That's the only time I've seen a Skinwalker since, and I hope I never see one again. To start this off, there are 0 bears, moose, or elk where I lived at the time. At the time I was around 12 or 14, and I was with my friend, who I will call Kayla. We planned on going on a picnic around her fields. As we walked up a smaller hill, Kayla pushed me to the ground and whispered, "Do you see that?" At least 20 or so feet away, there was a dark figure. It was standing on 4 thin limbs, and its head was narrow, similar to a horse or a deer, but it was completely black. I couldn't make out the features, but it had a mane like a lion. The mane-like fur ran along its back, stopping near the rear, and it also had no tail. Here's a side note: all of the cattle were moved to a completely different area, nowhere near this one, so no other livestock animals were in those fields, but this thing was just staring off. Suddenly, my friend stood up and made a rush for the exit that was at least 2 miles away. I didn't hesitate to follow her. We finally stopped near the latch fence that leads to where she stays at, and we looked back. It was slowly walking back into the trees. This sight, to this day, still gives me chills. I guess I'll start with a background. I'm a 33-year-old female, but the story takes place when I was a teenager, living in the suburb of Chicago. The village I lived in was quiet and middle class. We lived like a mile from the police station, and the worst crimes we had was a murder or two and robbery once in a blue moon. 99% of the time, boring and more boring. Unless you had a car, you were stuck just walking around the park at night with your friends, which was kind of boring. But anyways, one night, my girlfriend and I decided to go hang out at a park with some guys at like 12 a.m. The night was a bit windy and had a full moon. I even got a kiss that night from the boy that I liked, but the night wasn't just fun and hanging out late. There's a deep forest in the park with a stream with a playground right next to it. The same playground we went to with swings and jungle gym columns. There's a bridge, the one that everyone uses, and another bridge made of rocks that's barely used because it's deeper in the forest. They're both over the stream, connecting the forest and park area. I'll get to the rock bridge in a minute. We hung around on the swings and chatted and just spent the evening together. I'm sitting down and just looking around, talking and enjoying the peace and quiet and the moonlight. I have a full view of the forest. I then see something moving deep in the woods, some dark shape. It looked like it was crawling out of the forest, an arm, then another arm. Then it pulls itself out of the stream. This figure happens to be darker than the surrounding forest. As I'm just sitting there, frozen, I think I'm seeing things. And it just kind of lays there on the ground, but it doesn't move. A flash of fear comes across me. What if it comes this way? I then look over to my friends, and no one notices anything. I look back, and it's gone. Did it go back or go somewhere? At this point, I really want to get out of there. Then, one of my friends is asking all of us, "Did you guys hear about the urban legend of the rock bridge over the stream?" Apparently, some kids or something played on the bridge and fell over and died. What a thing to say after what I saw, but I didn't ask anyone anything and just pretended that I never saw anything. But this experience stuck with me. I never talked about it because it must have been my imagination. Things like that only happen in scary movies, right? After all of this, I rarely went to the park after that. Who knows what would have happened if this black thing saw me the same time that I saw it. I live right next to a Navajo reservation and have made friends with many of the people there my age. We like to hang out, play video games, and just be normal teens. I walk over a lot since my best friend lives a little less than a mile away from me. This isn't a long trek, and it only takes about 25 to 30 minutes. I have made this trip dozens of times and have grown very comfortable with it. I know the people along the way, so I'm not scared or on edge. There is a patch of forest, however. About midway there, it's a little unnerving sometimes. There is always that feeling of being watched. This was a regular occurrence for me, so I try to just ignore it and shake it off as my mind playing tricks on me. This day, I spent more time at my friend's house than I meant to, and when I left, it was already getting dark. I reached the stretch of forest right as the sun disappeared from the sky. I shivered a little as I readied myself to begin the journey through. I was 10 steps in when I heard a branch snap. You know the sound, the one that screams, there is definitely someone or something there with you. I froze, not sure what I should do next. Should I run? Should I turn around and book it back to my friend's house? I didn't know the best option in this situation, so I whispered, "Hello?" Hearing my voice crack as the words fell from my lips, I don't know why I even opened my mouth, but it was out there, so I listened for any reply. My heart sank when the answer came back in the sound of my voice. "Hello?" My heart pounded against my chest. I felt like I was gonna faint. "Hello?" My voice came again, but not from my mouth. I wanted to run, but my feet felt cemented to the ground. I couldn't scream. I couldn't reply. "Hello? Hello? 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 Hello?" as my voice echoed over and over from a short distance away. I couldn't pinpoint exactly where it was coming from. It sounded like it was everywhere around me. "Hello? Hello? 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 Hello?" It repeated. "Stop it!" I finally managed to tear from my lips. Everything went silent. For a long minute, nothing happened. The air grew stale, and I realized for the first time that there was no typical forest sound. There were no bugs, no frogs, or crickets. Nothing. I stood there, terrified, waiting to see what would happen next. "Stop it!" it mimicked back. I had enough and was willing my heavy legs to move. Before I could take a step, I heard some rustling in the bushes 20 feet to my left. I watched as a deer head with huge antlers protruded through the brush as it came further out and stood up on twos. I took off. I flew out of the woods and all the way home in record time. I said nothing to my mom when I got there. I just went up to my room, laid down, and thought about what happened. My mom came in at some point and asked me if everything was alright. I replied yes, I was just tired. I don't know why I didn't tell her. I guess I was afraid of how she would react. I called my friend and told him everything. He freaked out and told me that no matter what happened that night, to not reply or look out my window. But this terrified me even more. He said to call him the next morning and he would explain more, and that he had to speak to his grandfather as soon as possible. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I stayed awake, listening to every little sound the night brought. Around 3 a.m., just as I was about to drift off, the air changed. The night sounds got quiet. I felt my heart begin to pound. I lay there and waited, pulling the covers over my head like a child, far too scared to move. It came after a long moment. "Hello?" I cried. It was all I could do. "Hello? Stop it!" It mocked what I had said in the woods again. It was terrifying enough when it copied what I said. But then, it did something new. It called my name. "Amy." My mother's voice. "Amy! Amy! Come here! Hello? Stop it!" My voice again. For the rest of the night, the creature outside my window called my name in my mother's voice and repeated what I said in the woods over and over. In the morning, when the sun broke through the dark, it finally stopped. I fell into a deep sleep. I woke up around 12 to my friend calling to tell me he had spoken to his grandfather and could explain what happened to me. He said there was a creature that they called yenaglooshi, or he who goes on all fours, or a skinwalker. He explained that it was an evil witch that used dark magic to transform into an animal with the attributes it required, and that this witch had caught my scent and knew me now. I was also given a warning that since it knew me, it would always follow me, and that I would always have to be careful. Last night, I heard scratching on my window, then a low hum. The creature began saying my name again, but also adding in things I hadn't said in my mother's voice. At one point, it started calling my name, but drawing it out really far, like Amy. It tried to get me to come outside or to open the door and let it into my house. This went on all night. At this point, I feel like I'm going crazy. I don't know what to do. Is this thing seriously going to stalk the shadows around me for the rest of my life? I don't think I can take that. Many of you who love paranormal stuff may have already heard of the word nagual here in Mexico, and I would guess that also on some other countries in Latino America, we call that way people who can shapeshift into animals. Well, here's my story. It was a cold night, I remember, because it was really weird for it to get cold on that side of the country. This was in my parents' house, in a small pueblo, or small town, and back in the day, it was one of the last houses outside of town. Not so many neighbors, but a lot of trees and nature around. The house has a long backyard where we used to have sheep. At one side, a small water stream and trees to the other side. The sheep then started to bleat very loud, something we could call screams. My father then went to give a check on a window in the back side of the house. I still recall his face when he came back quickly, and in a low, urgent voice, he told my mom, "Ve agarra a tu padre y a tus hermanos y diles que vengan ya ahorita. Go ask your father and brothers to come here immediately." They were 4 brothers, my grandfather and my father. When everyone was there, a few minutes later, my father started to tell us what he saw. In the barn, we had 10 sheep. At the moment my father gave a look, all of them were together in just one corner. At the center, there was some kind of big animal. My father described it as a bear, which makes totally no sense, but he said it was big, hairy, and it seemed to be eating one sheep there. This one sheep was screaming really bad. Then my grandfather told my mom to keep us inside of the house and to keep me in there also with her. If you go outside now, you may catch a bad air. So he made some kind of prayer holding his machete. So his prayer, I remember he said the names of my uncles and also my father's. He then went outside. That's when my grandfather started to yell at the darkness, telling things like, "Vete de aquí, no tienes nada que ver aquí. Deja esta casa. Go away, you have nothing to do here. Leave this house." My father told me that he saw how this thing was in a pose, eating the sheep, which was laying on the ground, still screaming by the way. And when my grandfather yelled at it, this thing seemed to stop and raise its head up towards my family. This thing was only staring at them. Not a single noise, and also no red or shining eyes. Only the shadow looked like it was looking at them. So my father decided to do something at last. He took a big rock. He picked it up from the ground and threw it at this thing. Maybe not the best thing to do in this situation, but I guess this thing was not that strong. Or maybe because it was 6 of us and we all had machetes. But when the rock hit it, this being turned its back and ran away to the forest, running on all 4 legs like an animal would. They then approached the sheep, and my grandpa said how the sheep was on the ground, but it was still alive, but it was completely unskinned. It was horrifying, at least. My grandfather then sacrificed it to stop the suffering. After that night, a family friend told us a story about someone new in town that apparently was a naguat. He told us he spoke to that man and he told him to leave the town. Indeed, we never happened to live something similar after that. I saw some videos about skinwalkers on TikTok, so I started watching videos about them on YouTube, and there was a whole podcast where this guy just read stories about them from Reddit and other stories that people submitted. Our ward at church purchased a piece of land way back in the day. It's seriously just wooded area with a little bit of swamp. We would always go there for campouts and scouts, and at night, when it was pitch black, we would all play manhunt. Well, one time, we all got down to one person whose name was David. Growing up, he was super fast, and he would hide really good so nobody could ever find him. He would always end up being the last person. Well, one time, it was down to David, and we had split up and gone way deep in the forest towards the swamp because it seems like it was impossible to find him. We thought he might have gone a little bit further than we normally go. We started getting into some more muddy and wet terrain as we get closer to a swamp-like area where the water is most likely shin deep, and we saw David way out in the swamp, and he wasn't wearing a shirt. And with the spotlight on him, he looked super pale, but he just stood there and didn't say a word. You could seriously tell something was off. Then, all of a sudden, we heard David from behind us, yelling, trying to get our attention, so we would keep trying to chase him down. Meaning, what we saw in front of us was definitely not him. So being a bunch of 12 to 17-year-old boys, we started yelling and running back to the campsite as fast as we could. Nobody believed us. In fact, for years everybody made fun of it, calling the ghost of David. But then I started listening to these stories, and every single one of them sounds just like what happened in some way or another. I'm going to start this off by saying it's a long read, but it's worth it. My friend and I were talking about this creepy experience we had, and I'm trying to get to the bottom of it. So I figured I'll turn to Reddit for some answers, if there are any. People might think that this is fake, but I don't care, whether you believe it or not. I have no clue if this animal or creature is a skinwalker or just a very creepy animal. This took place around 2019, and I do live in Tennessee, right on the outskirts of the Appalachian Mountains. So here it goes. 2 of my friends and I were driving on a desolated back road at night. We were jamming to music and talking. Everything was normal. I was driving. My friend Hannah was in the passenger seat, being the DJ. and our friend Chris was in the back seat behind me. Hannah was trying to pull up a song on YouTube that wasn't on Spotify, so it was silent for a bit. While she was waiting on the website to load, Chris and I were still talking. We then came up on a small animal in the road, but I didn't think anything of it. Well, I expected the animal to move pretty quickly once it saw us coming down the road, but it didn't. As I got closer, I slowed down to let the animal have enough time to run off, but it still stayed very still. It almost looked frozen, and the closer I got, I could make out that it looked like some kind of cat. The only thing was, it didn't look like any sort of cat I ever seen. It looked like it had fur, but the fur was flesh colored. Its ears were very small, almost like the ears of a kitten, even though it was only a tiny bit bigger than a house cat. It was laying in a way that looked like the Sphinx was facing us. The scariest thing about it though was its eyes. Not to sound over dramatic, but its eyes literally looked like the pits of hell were burning inside of them. They were bright red, orange-like, and had twinkles of yellow in them that reflected off the headlights. As we got closer, the whole car was silent, and I just stared ahead. This cat scared the shit out of me, and it still wasn't moving. I felt a huge pit in my stomach and began having intense anxiety. It was almost like I was frozen, but I was not about to stop to figure out what this cat was. At this point, I had to steer around a bit to pass it without hitting it. I was like 3 inches away from touching this thing, and as I slowly crept by it, I watched it through the window the entire time. And it didn't even flinch, and the eyes still had the same glow, even without my headlights directly on it. After we passed it, about 5 seconds later, Chris yells, "What the fuck was that?" I immediately start freaking out and shout, "I don't know." Hannah looks up from her phone and says, What did y'all see?" She looked behind us and kept asking. We explained what happened and she said, "I didn't see anything behind us." Chris and I looked back, and sure enough, it was gone. We drove up the road to a church and turned around in the parking lot. We now wanted to get back to Hannah's as soon as possible. When we got back, we rushed in and told her mom what we saw. But we didn't mention that it looked like a cat. We described it as a small animal. Her mother stops for a minute and says, "Was it a cat?" We were blown away. We told her it was. And she said that her and a cousin came across the same exact thing when they were teens, only it was in a different area and they saw it peeking out of the bushes. She still to this day doesn't know what it was, and she said that she thinks about it from time to time, even after 30 years. So I guess I want to know a few things. What was this? It didn't look like a bobcat, mountain lion, or fox. Is it a demon, skinwalker, Wendigo, or unknown creature? I heard all of the legends regarding the woods at night. Don't look up in the trees, don't respond if your mother calls your name. But everyone I have told this to tells me it was most likely a scared bobcat, or that they never heard of anything else before. So if anyone makes it this far and has some answers, I would greatly appreciate any answers. This happened directly to me. At the time of this story, I was a 12-year-old male who lived in California. For a summer trip, me and my family flew to Idaho for a week to stay with my cousins. We stayed at their house for 2 days, then came the best part, until what happened, that is. On the 3rd day, we drove to a small city in the Rocky Mountains of central Idaho. They owned a cabin. The first day was fishing at nearby lakes, playing games, and meeting a few of the neighbors on the small street. Everyone we met was nice. It was amazing. I thought nothing could go wrong. Let me stop here, and before I say more, here's a layout of the area. The room where I slept was at the back of the house. There was no fence at the back of the backyard because it was on the bank of a freezing cold river. Directly on the other side of the river was a huge mountain covered by a thick forest of pine trees. A small path starts on the other side of the river, but there's no bridge. But there is a bridge, a quarter of a mile down the road, in front of our house. I went to bed that night, and I woke up around 2 a.m, needing to use the bathroom. I got up and did my thing, then headed back to my room. As I got into bed, I felt hot, so I opened my window. Not even 15 minutes after I opened my window, I heard the most terrifying screech come from the forest. It was raspy, but a high-pitched voice. I know for a fact it wasn't human. I heard plenty of stories from YouTube channels that often describe creatures that make weird noises that sound sort of human, but aren't. I heard it once more, but this time, closer. I eventually fell asleep after not hearing it for a while again. In the morning when I woke up, we explored the town. At around 7 p.m., me and my sister and my cousins got permission from our parents to go explore the forest. I felt uneasy, considering the creepy human-like noises in the night that I was hearing. The oldest cousin, Alex, who was 16, took a loaded pistol, a lighter, and backpack of snacks. I carry a hunting knife and a flashlight. The cousin my age, Julia, took just a flashlight. My sister Brianna and the other cousin Karina, who were both 10, took some extra batteries and a small bag of candy each. We made our way across the bridge at the end of the street and back to the path on the side of the river across from the house. All of us began the hike to the top of the mountain. We made it to the top of the mountain in an hour and a half. The view from 9,000 feet was incredible. We then stayed a little bit longer up there, and at 8:55, Alex and I figured it was time to head down, and we ordered the group to the path. At this time, it was dark now, and the sun had fully set. Julia and I turned on our flashlights and shined them ahead as we walked. When we were halfway down the mountain, which was about 45 minutes into the walk, I got this dreadful feeling you get when you're being watched and followed. Seconds later, I heard something coming from the bushes, a few yards into the side of the path that we were walking on. I brushed it off as some type of small animal. And about 5 minutes after this, we heard a noise, and it gripped me with fear, and my heart dropped to my stomach. It was that same horrifying screech from last night, echoing through the forest from a mile or two away. I told everyone we needed to move faster, and we did. The noise went off again, but closer, and again, and closer. Whatever that thing was, it was moving faster than us. We were full on speed walking by then, but it still wasn't fast enough because soon the screeching stopped, and we heard loud steps 30 yards off to the right. I got that feeling that I was being watched again. Alex took his gun and fired 2 shots in the general direction of the steps. The creature backed off, but even though we thought it was gone, I still sensed we were being watched. As the river came into sight, it caught me and everyone else by surprise. I heard the path of gravel crunching behind us. As I looked back into the darkness, I saw the outline of something that resembled a human. I told Alex, and his face went pale when he looked. We told the rest of the group quietly, and on 3, we all broke out into a run towards the river. Whatever that thing was, it was extremely fast. When we reached the river, we figured there wasn't enough time to get to the bridge, which was still a quarter of a mile further along the side of the river. So we jumped in and swam across the ice-cold water. This thing got to the river just as we made it up to the bank and into the backyard. Julia and I shined our flashlights and finally got a good look at it. It was a massive, hairy creature that was about 7 feet tall. It had huge, razor-sharp claws like a bear. Its eyes glowed red when the flashlight shined on them. Alex then took a shot at it, and it darted off within one final screech. We all looked at each other scared. Alex then explained everything to our parents. They didn't know what to make of it and had never heard of anything like it. I'm thankful that nothing happened to us, and also that I had noticed the creature behind us. If I hadn't, one of the others might not have noticed it until it was too late. The next time I stay at that cabin, I'm never going into those woods again. This story comes from Gallup, New Mexico. Family members are inside their home and getting ready for bed. All of a sudden, the dogs outside start raising a ruckus. The man of the family, including an uncle and some nephews, go outside to investigate, concerned about coyotes getting into the hen house. They think they see something moving about within the trees to the back of the house. The uncle picks up a handful of rocks and throws one after another into the trees. However, they hear or see nothing further outside of the ordinary, and so they end up returning to the house. With everything normal, the night is quiet and the dogs have stopped barking. They decide it's safe to go into bed. Just then, they hear a loud rustle from the trees, from the limbs whipping and branches snapping. They rush back out to the yard. All is quiet again. For 30 minutes or so, they stand guard, but not even the wind is blowing. The next morning, they go back outside and see that the gate to the hen house, as well as the door, is wide open. All of the birds are gone. The man ends up searching the yard, and out by the outhouse, they discover, instead, an odd set of tracks going back and forth, as if something upon 2 feet was pacing between there and the trees. Finding no signs of the chickens, they return to the area around the hen house to look for similar tracks, knowing that only one person or someone similar could have opened the gate and the door. But the only marks they find are within the pen, and they all belong to chickens. The grandmother, who is standing at the back door of the house, tells them that it was a skinwalker. She says a prayer, and together they yell in a loud voice and in Navajo, "Go away, go bother someone else." It all started when summer came, and me and my 3 friends, Leah, Kathy, and Jennifer, were all planning to go camping. Leah asked her dad if he could drop us off, and he agreed. When the next day came, we started heading up. Leah's dad had set up the camper that we were using. He told us there were some spare blankets inside in case we got cold. Leah's dad finally got into his truck and turned around. He stopped and rolled down his window and said, "No boys," to all of us. He then gave us a smile to let us know he was joking with us and drove off. There was 3 rooms, 1 master bedroom, and 2 rooms with bunks. Each room had a TV in it, so nobody cared what room they got. Everyone knew that Jennifer didn't like small rooms, so we ended up letting her have the big room. I was in the room with Leah, and Kathy was in a room by herself. I started unpacking when we heard a loud noise outside. "Leah, did you hear that?" "Hear what? That noise?" We both looked at each other, startled, and then continued unpacking. But something seemed off. It was the fact that Leah was so chill about it. I was done unpacking, so I walked outside and started a fire. Jennifer walked out, and then she asked if I saw it. I responded with, "Saw what?" That's when she started freaking me out. She then started staring at me, but behind me, panicking. Her eyes darted back and forth, and then she was calm. I felt as if something was watching me, so I turned around, and I saw an orb in the corner of my eye, reddish, black, but by the time I turned around to fully look, it was gone. I was so freaked out because we were in the middle of nowhere, you can say, and it was only the three of us by ourselves. I then told Kathy that she could cook instead. We had her family's secret recipe of shepherd's pie and a bunch of vanilla cupcakes. There were about a dozen cupcakes left in the open box, so we just left it on the table and went to bed. I could hear the TV coming from Kathy's room, so I punched the wall and told her to be quiet. Right after I said it, everything went quiet. But then, there was a small scream in the distance. It didn't sound human. It gave me chills that ran down my spine, but I ended up dozing off. But then, I woke up in the middle of the night, hearing noises, like if someone was in the kitchen. I wake up Leah, and then we walk out into the small hallway that led into the kitchen. We saw Jennifer sitting on the table, just staring straight ahead, with Kathy being right behind me. We were looking at her, and Jennifer was making weird noises, weird sounds. She was really creeping us out. She never did this or stared into space this often. But then I noticed something in the corner of my eye. It was a shadow. It was staring at Jennifer, and then it slowly turned to face me and Kathy. I froze. Kathy froze. Then Jennifer looked at us as if she was being mind controlled. And then this figure or shadow ran out the window, and Jennifer dropped her head into the table. We were trying to wake her up afterwards, but she wouldn't wake up. This experience still scares me to this day, and it is only one of the creepiest things I have ever seen. Me and the others are still very close friends. We even live together now. But we all remember that night and whatever it was that we saw. It turns out that Jennifer remembers seeing it in the daytime, but she says she doesn't remember anything when nighttime came and when we saw it. It freaks us out even more now, knowing that our friend wasn't even awake and staring into space with her eyes wide open. So I want to first say that I don't know much about skinwalkers and other creatures of similar nature. I just now started learning of their potential existence. So now I'm willing to learn and be educated even more on these topics, especially ever since I came across something at night. There's this park my girlfriend and we used to go to smoke there a lot, and we encountered this same dog-like thing multiple times, and it was always at night. It looked like a really huge black dog with round bear-like ears and yellowish eyes. The first few times we saw it, we didn't think much of it, but then we noticed that it kept just like spawning in. It never made a sound, and it always just stared at us, and it would follow us around the park in a creepy way. And just an FYI, we encountered this dog while we were high and while sober on many different occasions. Anyways, we ended up not going to that park no more. But before we stopped going, one of the creepiest things that's ever happened to me happened at that park. We were walking from the parking lot to the park, and we would just see this thing emerge from behind a tree and follow us and try to block our path back to the car. Sometimes we had to run and jump a fence just to get away from it. we never had a single dangerous interaction. Outside of this one time we were at the deepest corner of the park that was bordering a small forest, and we had to jump about 2 fences to avoid that thing. I do have a theory. It could be a stray, but it really did not act like a dog at all. It didn't even feel alive. I felt like it was just actually watching us for some reason, but it was really eerie. It was mid-November 2021, and me and about 10 friends were camping in the woods in the Sawtooth National Forest near Petite Lake. There were 2 groups of 4 people in 2 tents and one in a car, and me and my buddy were in hammocks near the edge of the camp. It's about 1 a.m. and we all had been sleeping for about 2 hours. I wake up to my hammock friend panting in a heavily way and yelling my name. I'm confused and get up and help him, but he's paralyzed by fear. He said that he had an extremely vivid dream that there was a black figure, tall and slender, trying to break into his car after he had seen this figure decapitate me and the rest of his friends. He said that he woke up to the figure near the car and saw all of our heads stuck on sticks throughout the camp. He then said that he clicked the alarm button of his vehicle and the figure began to run in circles around the car and then stopped, and then it dashed off extremely quickly into the woods. I was obviously freaked out at this point, and I immediately felt very uneasy. But I told him it was just a bad dream and that he needs to go back to sleep. I also had a hard time going to sleep, so I could tell that both of us, after about 5 minutes, both with fear at this point, we heard our friend in the tent, No, don't take me." As a side note, we had not awoken anyone else in the camp at this point. This freaked both of us out because we had no idea what was going on. We were also very vulnerable in our hammock by ourselves on the edge of our almost 50-yard camp. The screams of our buddies proceeded to wake up most of the rest of the camp, and we find out that our friend in the vehicle that my buddy said clicked the alarm of the car was awake. So all of us scared and awake have a conversation about what is going on, and the buddy in the car says that he heard scratching on the window and heard something pull the door. He also said that he had seen the black figure running around the car as well. We were all freaked out at this point and decided to move into the same tent. Our friend with the dream also claimed a similar murder story to the friend in the hammock. The next morning, we all talked and so many of us experienced what happened that night. The 6 of us that were camping, we all determined that it must have been some sort of being that was giving us nightmares. We called it a Wendigo, but we have no idea. Also, we had friends that stayed at the same site about 6 months earlier, and a few of them did notice weird things happening at camp at night, like the feeling of being watched, or the feeling of something or a being walking around the tent. All of this is just strange stuff that happens in the Idaho mountains. Or what does this sound like? And what do you all think? My dad told me the story of when he lived in Mexico, and he was like 8 or so. He went out to the bathroom. Keep in mind it was in the middle of the night. When he walked out a decent bit away from the rancho, he heard someone whispering behind him. My dad, at the time, being the chicken that he was, he ran into the bosque, into the forest. Alright, so for those who don't know, depending on what part of Mexico you are visiting, back in the day, the bathrooms in the ranchos were close by the woods and nowhere near the house. You would have to walk out to the woods in the middle of the night if you had to use it. I know because when my parents used to take me to Mexico, I had to do this a few times. So he said he ran into the forest instead of going back into the house. After a few minutes, he started walking back to the house, and halfway into the field, he saw a shadow, a dark figure, just moving around as if it was someone crouched down. He said he was planning on going around it, but then this thing lifted its head up and with red eyes stared at him. He said that's when he lost it and ran back into the woods even further than before. He said he didn't even look back to see if this thing was after him, but after a while, he stopped to rest a bit, but then he heard the whispers behind him. But this time, it was a bit closer than last time, and he thought to himself, whatever this thing is, it's following me. I need to get the hell out of here. So he said he ran deeper into the forest, and then he stopped when he was up on a decent sized hill, and then he heard the whispering again, but this time it was like a few feet in front of him. So he just stood there paralyzed, about to shit himself, until suddenly he heard flapping and he felt a gust of wind in front of him. He looked up and said he saw what looked to be a huge crow. He said that when it was flying away, it made a loud, cackling sound. When I was in my early teens, my dad would drag us to Kentucky every chance he got. 10 hours each way, it seemed to be most of our trip was driving. Finally, we would arrive at Aunt Lanny's house. God, I loved her. She had 9 kids. My cousin Ronnie decided that he would tell us about an urban legend called the Devil Lady of Trace Licking Hollow. Ronnie shared with us the following. Up on the outer ridge of this hollow, way above the tree line, lived a bitter old woman who hated everyone and everything. She was so full of hate that she started doing things to her neighbors. She would take pets. When she would pass a neighbor on the road, as they were walking beside the road, she would try to take a swipe at them. As this woman got older, she started looking into people's windows, scaring everyone, but she would always disappear by the time any of the family would come out of their house. Then one family finally had enough. The father grabbed his hunting rifle and made the hike up to the ridge where the old lady lived. When he entered her property, something was not right. It was too quiet. Then he saw her laying out in the middle of her small garden, dead. But she wasn't just dead, she was dead for a very long time. How could she still be scaring the whole hillside? He also told me to stay away from the windows in the deepest part of the night. I was thinking this was just a ploy to get me to go to sleep and not get out of bed. You see, I'm a night owl. My mother says I've been that way before I was even born. So I walk upstairs and get into bed, and I can't seem to go to sleep, so I start reading a book that I had brought. The last time I remember, it was 3 o'clock. I turn over and look towards the window, and I freeze. There in the second floor bedroom window was this hideous face I have ever seen. It had long hair, skin so thin that some of it was there and some just wasn't. Red eyes, yellow teeth. I was frozen. I didn't know what to do. I threw the blankets over my head and just kept praying that this creature would go away. The next morning, I came down for breakfast, and my aunt looked at me and said, "How did you sleep?" Of course I lied to her and told her okay, I guess. And when my aunt left the room, my cousin Ronnie looks at me and says, "She always knows what's going on here in the hollow." In the late 1970s, my Aunt Janie and her husband Jack were driving home late one night. They were returning from a revival. As they were driving along an isolated road upon the reservation, they saw what looked like a fox run in front of the truck. My aunt said that the little animal drove into the ditch alongside the road. My uncle, who is kind of an animal lover, stopped the truck and rolled back slowly, thinking maybe that they had hit it. It was a moonless night. As Aunt Janie rolled down her window, she could see the animal laying in the ditch. As she leaned over to get a closer look, she saw to her surprise a figure that was much larger. It was actually a woman covering what appeared to be fox hair and skin, her face painted and wearing a collection of necklaces. As she was looking, the woman suddenly raised her arm and pointed at her. My aunt screamed and my uncle just sped off. As my aunt looked back over her shoulder, she saw the Skinwalker sit up, but as it was very dark, she soon lost sight of it. The next day, when they were up and about and hadn't mentioned what they saw to anybody, they heard word going around that a Skinwalker had been seen prowling around the reservation, and everyone was arranging for the medicine man to come and bless their homes. While trading stories around a campfire, my friend recalled an encounter he had while serving an LDS mission. My friend's mission region had a reservation within its boundaries. However, it was far from where he was serving. On one occasion, him and his mission companion were told to travel more far than usual to meet with some investigators. This, however, took them near the reservation. On their way home, their car ran out of gas, and it wasn't until late at night that they were able to continue the journey home. My friend, who was driving while his companion slept in the passenger seat, chose a different route that took him through some back roads in an attempt to try to get home sooner. He told us he was driving above the speed limit when he noticed movement in the woods lining the road. Because coyotes were common in the area, he took little notice first. Then he looked out the window and slammed on the brakes. The sudden stop made his companion awake, who wanted to know what was wrong. My friend was shaken and said he would tell him once they got home. He only told him to say a prayer. By the time they made it home, his companion was dying to know what happened. And my friend told him, as I was driving, I looked down at the road next to the vehicle, and I saw 6 men running on all fours, keeping up with the car. I was driving 40 miles per hour. This happened when I was 11 years old, which I'm now 13, and I still remember everything as clear as day. I basically lived in the middle of nowhere, so I didn't have many friends. There was this huge forest though, so I would play in that. One day, I went to go play, and it was almost around 6:30, so it was kind of dark now. Let me mention, I lived in Wisconsin at the time. I went deep into the forest, and everything was good until 7 o'clock rolled around. Now, I was used to hearing weird noises in the woods, but nothing like this. I heard this awful scream. Not human. It was like a demon, like if it was trying to scare me. So of course I went to investigate. I got about maybe half a mile in when I saw this non-human-like creature perched in a tree. Now instead of running for my life, I froze in shock and fear, and before I knew it, that thing, that awful smelly thing, was right behind me. I just wanted to scream for help, but I didn't. I didn't know what that creature could do to me, so I stood there like a rock, hoping it would leave. It screamed again, but even worse than the first time, and I felt like I was gonna go deaf. Eventually, after minutes of that thing staring at me, it flew, and I mean flew up to its trees. I stood there looking at it for what felt like hours. Now, I was gonna take out my phone and try to blind it with the flash so I could make a run for it, and that's what I did. Now, did I mention I was a little chubby for my age, so I couldn't run so fast? And that definitely sucked, cause that creature jumped and ran after me through those woods. I felt the world spinning around me as I screamed for help. That creature caught up, and I felt like my life was over. I made a dash for the bushes, hoping to be able to hide in one, which I did. Now I waited for at least half an hour, thinking he was gone, so I made a dash to the back door, hoping that thing wasn't behind me, but instead, he was perched on our air conditioner. I told my parents that very night, and they called me crazy, but I know what I saw, and I'm never gonna go into those woods again. Monsters are real, and I don't know what that creature was, but who knows what he would have done if he got his hands on me. Sophomore Vernandria Livingston and her family were having a garage sale in Church Rock, New Mexico, on the Navajo res. She was selling some of the clothes that she had outgrown, and her dad was selling clothes and shoes that he didn't like anymore. The day was going by, and then a man came to their garage sale, and he seemed very interested in her dad's clothes, so he bought all of them. Livingston thought this was a bit strange, because the clothes seemed like they would be too big for the man. Several days later, Livingston's dad started having terrible dreams, and he said what he saw was too scary to even tell anyone. After this, he started seeing sores all over his body that always seemed to be itching. I was scared and told him to go to the hospital, Livingston said. He told me that a doctor couldn't help him. He didn't bother going to the hospital, and he saw a medicine man instead, which is someone who practices traditional medicine. The medicine man said these symptoms were not a coincidence. Whoever bought the clothes at the garage sale was responsible for them. That person had used dark magic on Livingston's father out of jealousy. The medicine man also knew how to solve the issue. He said the buyer had put something on Livingston's land to target the family near their houses. The medicine man dug a hole, and inside he found a bundle of Livingston's father's clothes that were soaked in blood. The clothes were tied around a large stone that had strange carvings on them. The medicine man blessed the family and left with the findings. All the Livingston's problems ended, but she remained skeptical of who she could trust. A few weeks ago, I went back to the reservation to be with my family, while a medicine man was at our house, performing a ceremony to get rid of an evil presence. It appears someone had entered the house while my parents were away for a few days. Dirt from the cemetery was sprinkled throughout the house, and dark symbols were etched into the cedar shake on the side of the house. One was the symbol for coyote tracks, which stands for trickster, and the other was a snake, which means defiance. A few days later, my mother was almost bitten by a rattlesnake that found its way into the basket holding the laundry, even though she had just removed from the clothesline outside. My sister, that same day, was then thrown from her horse when it was startled by another snake. She said the snake appeared out of nowhere. She wasn't seriously hurt, but that night, my father came out of the house to find a pair of coyotes had gone into where the sheep are at. He chased them away before they could do any damage. He says the coyotes never come so close to the house. The prayer ceremony lasted about 2 hours. It didn't do me any good. As soon as I got into the country road, the check engine light came on. I was driving a rental car with less than 2,000 miles on it. I ignored it and kept on driving. As I left the state back into New Mexico, a truck driving beside me blew a tire, almost swerving into me. And then less than 15 minutes later, as we were coming up to this curve in the road, a van up ahead of me and in the lane to the right lost one of the ladders it was carrying on top. It flew off and hit the pavement right in front of me. It then bounced over the hood of my car and off to the shoulder. How it didn't come through the windshield, I'll never know. It happened so fast, I never even had the chance to move. Later that night, my father called me. He said that he and the medicine man went out to the cemetery and dug up a spot in front of my grandmother's headstone. She died years ago. It seems someone had buried the bones of a coyote there to put a curse on our family.